és a mitjanit a Barcelona. Puc veure com passa el vent.
Austerity is always a bad idea, or sometimes is justified. What do you think?
It depends on what you define as austerity. So there's nothing wrong with an economy that is growing deciding to pay back some debt. It's a very good idea because it means the next time the economy gets into trouble, the government can then run a larger deficit to compensate. It's sensible policy. Austerity is different. Austerity is when you try to cut when your economy is shrinking. And the idea behind this is that what is lacking is not demand in the economy, but is instead business confidence, as if business worries about the national debt more than anything else. So by cutting spending, we reassure taxpayers that they will pay less taxes in future. And we will reassure businesses that their investments will not be crowded out by government spending. And so we will cure the recession by cutting in the middle of a recession. Where this becomes even worse in Spain's case is when you do not have your own currency and you are linked to all the other European economies who are trying to do austerity at the same time. As we have seen, this is a disaster because what happens is the GDP of the economy, the size of the economy shrinks and the same amount of debt gets bigger, not smaller, the more that you cut. So every single country which has undergone an austerity program now has more debt, much more debt than when it began. Spain went into the crisis with 26% debt to GDP and is now close to 100. In the past year, its debts have gone up, I believe, I would need to check this, about 13%. So if the whole point of this is to reduce debt, it is a terrible, terrible failure. If the whole point is to restore business confidence, it is a terrible failure. And given the unemployment rate that the Spanish economy has just now, it is a social as well as an economic disaster.
Since when do you think that austerity is a bad medicine for the European crisis?
Because what was wrong with Europe and what remains the problem in Europe is a banking crisis which the central bank, the ECB, cannot deal with. It is not a sovereign debt crisis. The crisis showed up in the sovereign debt markets, but the origins lay in the central bank and in the banking system. Here's how to think about this. Imagine you have all of these different economies that share one currency. None of them print the currency. So it's like Latin America in the 1980s where everyone's borrowing in dollars. They don't control the currency. Now, along comes the financial crisis and banks and holders of bonds start to get nervous. And the Greeks come along and say, hey, it turns out that the last government was lying about their deficits. Now, at that point in time, the European Central Bank should have taken the 50 billion euros of outstanding Greek debt that was going to be rolled over and stick it in the ECB's balance sheet. Call it something like the Hellenic Investment Trust. Tell the Greeks off, reform their tax system, and there'd be no problem. But the ECB at that time was run by Trichet, and all they cared about was inflation, and they would not do the simple central bank task of lender of last resort. They were not allowed to do so by their own constitution. So holders of assets, sovereign assets, throughout southern Europe looked at this and said, if the Greeks are not telling the truth, maybe the Portuguese aren't telling the truth. But more importantly, we've now got evidence that the central bank will not do what the Americans will do. They will not take the bad assets. They will not add liquidity to the system. They will not swap the assets for cash and recapitalize the banking system. So I'm sitting here with, let's say, Spanish government bonds. What happens if the euro breaks up? I'm sitting with worthless paper. So given this, all the holders of these bonds started to demand higher interest rates. That's why the yields went up. Now, the government response was, well, obviously we need to cut budgets, which has nothing to do with the problem. It's a central banking problem. So you start to cut budgets. And as you see in 2010 and 2011, the more that they cut, the more the yields went up. So if the financial markets wanted austerity, the more they cut, you should have seen the yields going down, but they went up. When did we see the yields going down? We saw the yields going down when the central bank in Europe introduced the LTRO, the long-term refinancing operation. Then we see it with LTRO2. Then we see it with a thing called ELA, Emergency Liquidity Assistance. And we see it finally with Draghi's promise to do whatever it takes. What solved the problem, or at least calmed the problem, was the emergence of a central bank policy that was credible to the financial markets, that made them want to hang on to European bonds. The absence of that policy was the problem. It had nothing to do with the spending habits of governments. As I said, Spain went into the crisis with 26% net debt to GDP. How could that possibly be the trigger?
You know that there is a lot of people that thinks, even in Spain, that the responsibility of the crisis is that we live better than we have to. How do you...
Yes, this is an old story, because you get this false analogy. So you have this analogy, we need to live within our means. Well, you have to remember that for a government, your means are an outcome of policy. It's not like a family. People say, well, it's like a family. If this family spends too much, they need to stop spending. Well, that's simply not true. Families don't get to issue debt. Families don't get to import people into the country and tax them and issue debt across 3 or 4 generations. Sovereign states do. So this argument that it's a very simple thing, we all need to stop spending, falls apart, because if we all stop spending at once, no one is generating the income from which anyone else can pay back their debt. So the economy shrinks and the debt gets bigger rather than smaller. Now, it's absolutely true that when there was easy money flowing from the north to the south, when German financiers couldn't get enough of Spanish government bonds and Spanish real estate assets, and the French were the same way, there was lots of easy money, and you built airports you didn't need and regional opera houses that will never stage a production. But if you add all those up, they're nothing in comparison to the accumulated debt of the banking system in Spain. And the big problem that Europe still faces is who is going to take responsibility for and who's going to take the losses on the assets in the Spanish banking system. And that's what the whole banking treaty is about. That's why it's stalled, because the Germans don't want to swallow it. And in fact, in fairness, they're not big enough to take the hit. So what are we left with? We're left with a central bank that promises to do whatever it will do. It doesn't have the means to do much. The Spanish banking system is seriously impaired, if not actually insolvent. And if it wasn't for emergency liquidity assistance, it would already be close to insolvent. And we have a series of sovereigns that can't agree how to deal with the problem. So what do? They squeeze the economy, they add liquidity, and they pray that the problem goes away.
Why do you think Germany and a few other countries in the north of Europe imposes austerity to the whole Europe, especially to the south?
Because we hear the story that they run the surplus and then the south runs the deficit. And that's true. But a simpler way to think about it is they are the creditors and you are the borrowers. So the way this happened was, when the euro came in, the northern economies became much more competitive, because the euro gave them an artificially low exchange rate. They also make very good stuff. They also make average stuff, but they make good stuff like BMWs and all the rest of it. But with the low exchange rate, they can make average stuff very well too. So they start to run a trade surplus. So everyone from Finland to Germany, but particularly the Germans, runs a trade surplus. Now, if you add up all of the deficits of the southern countries, it basically adds up to the German plus Finland, etc. trade surplus. Now, what's going on here? Well, when Germany's selling BMWs to someone, they're taking that money, and the savers in Germany, because they don't consume enough, are taking their money and putting it in the bank. Now, the bank isn't earning any money in Germany because people don't spend enough. So what do? They take it to the Spanish banking system and they buy a Spanish bank. Or alternatively, they get rid of their nice low-yielding German bonds and they buy Spanish bonds that have a slightly bigger upside. And then they turbocharge this by adding lots and lots of leverage. That is running the bank with very, very high levels of debt. So they're making lots of money on this. And the other side of this is all of this money's flying into the Spanish economy. So your interest rates fall, everyone gets a car loan, everybody gets a cheap mortgage, you start to get a housing boom. And why would you try and make things in Spain when you can make more money off of real estate? So an interesting comparison in Spain is if you compare the Basque region to the rest of the country. The Basque region's done reasonably well in comparison to everyone else for one reason. They didn't allow their cajas to get involved in real estate speculation. The Basques still make things which everyone else buys. So because of this, although they've taken a hit because the rest of Spain has taken a hit, they were somewhat shielded. The rest of Spain did what the laws of economics dictates, comparative advantage. If the Germans are good at making everything and they're giving you money to buy stuff from them, then what you do is you turn yourself into a banking, beaches and real estate hub. So Spain went from the 8th biggest industrial economy in the world in 1979 to the 17th in 2007. And what that meant was your whole economy was dependent upon external capital flows that are generated by someone else's demand. So when the financial crisis hit, it was just a question of time until those capital flows dried up. And then all of those over-leveraged investments in real estates came tumbling down. And you found out that what you'd done is hollowed out your economy. That's what the euro's done for you.
Countries apply other economic politic than the one imposed by Europe?
Only if Europe is radically restructured, because as it is just now, the problem with Spain and Greece and Portugal in particular, not so much Italy or Ireland in fact, and Spain is somewhat different in this regard because of its relatively competitive agricultural sector and because tourism, will continue to earn money. It's a big economy. But the problem is these southern countries, particularly Portugal and Greece, but to a certain extent Spain, you don't really have a business model. Because when you had all that cheap money coming from the north, which was their surplus being recycled in the south, then in a sense, it's not that you were living beyond your means. People were giving you the means to live. So you took that and you specialized, as I said, in things like tourism and building real estate and so on. And now you've got to find something new. Well, the problem with finding something new is that the people who can do something new for you, your startup generation, you're 25 years old with technical skills, your university graduates, they're all living in London because there's no jobs in Spain and they might not come back. So the repercussions of austerity are not just for the moment, they ring through the generations. If we have a generation without work, we also have a generation without skills and a generation without hope. So Spain and the periphery badly need a new economic model. But it's not clear to me what that model can be, particularly if it's just simply more of the same, where we have a fiscal treaty where everyone has to run a surplus, which is by definition impossible.
Is somebody taking advantage, winning lots of money with that crisis? Is some country or financial institution interested on that crisis not to be solved?
No, that's actually not the case. No one benefits from losing 20 to 30% of GDP. Even if you could run a short position on an entire economy, which would be very, very expensive, you would still make more money on the upside. You've got to remember at any point in time, 80% of the positions in the market are long. That means that 80% of them are betting on the future will be better than the past. And yes, we hear about hedge funds who do this, that, and the next thing. But we also know that hedge funds over the past 3 years have performed worse than sticking your money in an investment account and just betting on the index rising. So I think we can get a little bit too paranoid about the nefarious effects or the bad effects of investors betting on these things. Let's remember that the way that the Greek contagion problem, when people were worried about Greece blowing up, the bonds going to zero, the banks dumping those bonds, then selling Portugal, then selling Ireland, and the whole thing blowing up, a bank run through the bond market. The reason that was stopped is because the ECB managed to get the hedge fund community globally to buy all the outstanding Greek debt and hold it. Not short it, hold it. The hedge funds basically became the toxic balance sheet extension of the ECB. They did the job the ECB should have done, but couldn't done. So there's a lot going on in here below the radar that people don't really pay attention to. But it's simply not a story that bad investors are pushing Italy down and so on and so forth. What's going on is a much simpler story whereby the political elites of Europe in the north don't want to pay for their excessive lending, and the people in the south who borrowed simply can't pay it back.
Germany is taking advantage or not?
It's not that they're taking advantage. I understand why they're doing what they're doing. You have to think about it this way. The European economy is about 15 trillion euros. Okay? The German economy is just a shy over 4.5 trillion euros. The banking system's assets are 45 trillion euros. So in order to bail that out, the Germans would have to be at least 4 times the size of the economy they actually are. So if you think about the European banking system as a toilet, and all of the bad assets is something that needs to be flushed down the toilet, the Germans aren't simply a big enough cistern to flush the mess away. So if I were a German politician, and I knew that at the end of the day the creditor always ends up paying, I would try and put as much of the costs as possible onto the southern countries first, because inevitably the Germans are going to have to pay in some form, but they simply aren't big enough to solve the problem they're being asked to do. And if they were to try and do it, it would blow them up, which would ultimately hurt everyone else too.
You write in your book that the bank's business model for the past 25 years may be dying. The solution is that changing the way the banks act.
So what I mean, what you want me to say? What I mean by this? That the way that big banks have made money for the past 30 years after the privatization and deregulation of the 1980s was that they would do lots and lots of trades with each other. So Bank A sells derivative package to customer B, who then sells on another package as a hedge to customer C. Or somebody buys an oil future and then sells that to buy another contract on some other commodity. These types of things. Now, 70% of big bank profits come from trading. Trading is zero sum. It's simply one person loses, one person gains, and the bank writing the contract sits in the middle and takes the fees. So you do lots and lots and lots and lots of trades. As I said before, you lever up. You basically don't issue equity. You borrow lots and lots of money to basically amplify your bets. So if your bet's going to pay off 10%, you borrow 100% on top of that to amplify the bet. So big European banks run operating leverages of around 35 to 40 to 1, which means that for every dollar they've got out there or every euro they have out there, they have 35 in debt. But that debt is actually their asset footprint. The way that banks think about assets and liabilities is counter to a normal person. Their assets are what we would call liabilities. It's what they make money from. So you have a very, very large asset footprint, very, very high leverage. You do lots and lots of trades. And then you basically self-insure by doing things like writing CDS, credit default swap protection and stuff like this, which ultimately is no protection at all. Now, in order for that to work, you need to have assets to fuel the cycle. And we went through globally a 30-year bull run in equities, which has now come to an end, apart from QE distorting the market just now. We will always need equities because that's how companies raise capital, but the ability to run a book that gets twice the rate of growth of the underlying economy just by holding equities, that's gone. Second one is real estate. We have humped and dumped every housing contract almost on the planet, or at least in Europe and at least in the US. No one's going to be making 30% a year on real estate anytime soon, particularly in Spain. So the last asset class, which isn't even really an asset class, is commodities. And those commodities, whether they be cotton or corn or gold or oil, those markets are too small, too volatile, and too politically important to be manipulated. So as we found out recently that Goldman Sachs was manipulating the aluminum supply of the world by moving things from warehouse to warehouse, as soon as that becomes apparent, the activity is closed down by the regulators. So the basic fuel for the global cycle, which banks have went through, has either been depleted or is now going to be regulated. So that means that they can't run the same tricks. They're also being hit with very, very tough regulations. Their compliance costs are going through the roof. Their bonuses are being limited. Their derivatives trades are being posted on exchanges. All of this means that the size of the bank and its leverage ratios will come down over time, and with it, its profitability. And as its profitability comes down, what happens is the people who would go into banking because they have excessive salaries will no longer go because they don't get the excessive salaries. And the good news is that means the talent will be redistributed through the rest of the economy, which is what we need.
Last question. Which would be the correct economic politics to apply in Europe for ending the social effects of the crisis? What do you think?
Just stop doing it. It's very simple. You don't need to, I mean, it might help to have some, massive infrastructure spending, but I was in Spain 2 years ago, and I drove from Madrid out to Ogrove, from Ogrove to Santiago de Compostela, up to Asturias, Cantabria, to San Sebastian and back down. I saw one hole in 2,000 kilometers in the road. Spain's infrastructure is pretty damn good. So you're not going to get much multiplier bang by doing that. But simply, the economy itself has powerful tendencies to heal. Not all the time. Very serious depressions, particularly man-made depressions like austerity, do need to be compensated. After all, you're going to have to get your children home and you're going to have to get them jobs at some point after 5 years of destroying them. But at the same time, if we simply stop doing it, then the economy can start to recover. Just now, across the world, we see this as an experiment. The Americans have not cut, at least not significantly, apart from the sequester. And the economy is growing, haltingly, but it's growing. The Brits, who had all the same advantages, the British, had all the same advantages of the Americans, their own currency, so that they could devalue and so on. They decided to cut. They now have a 7% budget, well, a 6% budget deficit, and more debt rather than less. And their economy has been flatlined for 5 years. And in Europe, where they've cut the most, we see that basically the economy has contracted, GDP has collapsed, and unemployment has rocketed. So it's a very simple lesson. We don't need grand schemes. We don't need enormous initiatives. We don't need hundreds of billions of dollars of bond raising and spending. I just have a very simple proposal. Please, just stop doing it. Because the yields are not going to go up again if we stop doing it. Because the yields were going up because of a banking problem. So if we solve the banking problem, then the yields stay down, the debt gets rolled over, and the economies can start to grow. And when those economies start to grow again, even if it's low growth, as GDP rises, the same amount of debt gets smaller, the yields go down further, and you get onto a positive track of GDP growth rather than where we are now, which is a terrible position where both productivity and growth are eating each other in a downward spiral.
És a mitjanit a Barcelona. Puc veure com passa el vent